My name is Robert Claiborne Morris. I am an artist residing in Savannah, Georgia. I have been working on this body of work for 3.5 years. It is an inspiration by my friend, the author Douglas Blackmon, who has written a book called Slavery by Another Name, which received the Pulitzer Prize, and recently was turned into a documentary that aired on PBS of the same name. This body of work is a collection of pieces that span from portraits and landscapes to assemblages in which many of the documents and pieces that we'll talk about as we move through here are authentic to the era and found over the course of the 3 or 4 years of traveling across the South, looking through old farmhouses and slave shacks and broken down buildings and up and down the Savannah River for the objects that actually meant something to this era. We'll start the tour by moving over to this portrait. Here is a wound that will never heal. This is the painting of a man who actually lived during this era. It's a reprocessed photograph with oil on top. When we reprocessed the photograph, we learned and discovered that the man had a wound in his solar plexus that was so deep and so bloody that he would not live long. And bringing this man back to life in oil was a very exciting experience for me and something that has moved many people who've come through here. On to this next piece, titled Anonymous. This is oil and acrylic on wood panel with railroad spikes and other objects staked in the top of the piece. These pieces were all used by re-enslaved men to toil in the labor of forced labor up until World War II. The chains were found along the Savannah River, and these pieces here are shackles that are thought to have come from slave ships sailing up the Savannah River. This piece was a labor of love and required several months of work to complete. This is Stone Mountain. It is the largest piece in the collection. It is wood panel, burlap on wood panel. The tin that you see in the piece comes from an old shack that was thought to have been used in the re-enslavement process that I discovered. The glass and other found items were found along the Savannah River. It's a reinterpretation of the generals of Stone Mountain and requires the viewer to look once again at this historical period with a new set of eyes. If men were required to work as slaves after 1865, then the images and the iconic figures of that era need to be looked at once again, and that's what this body of work attempts to do. We move on to the next piece, titled Not Wind Enough. At first glance, it looks again like burlap, on wood panel, oil painting, white birch bark used for texture, and shavings of the same tin that came from that old sharecropper shack. Here, this totemic image of a mask looks again African, very iconic in many ways, but upon closer look you'll see that it's constructed out of a bellows. This is an industrial bellows that was used at the turn of the century by re-enslaved men in the coal and smelting mines of Alabama. It would have been used for up to 16 to 17 hours a day by men who would have been shackled and chained to these mines to keep these fires going and to keep industry moving forward without any pay. We'll move across the hall here to the Lincoln piece, but before we do this, I think it's awfully fitting that this collection is exhibited in the Telfair Museum in the very parlor where Mary Telfair, who has her sculpture looking out over these pieces, once entertained. She would have entertained here with hundreds of her very closest of friends who would have been served by slaves. And I think it says a lot about the South that we can put this kind of exhibition in this very building that once was served by slaves. This is my ode to Lincoln. I have titled it Now Close the Windows and Hush All the Fields, after the poem by Robert Frost. It again is burlap on wood panel. I used the burlap because I felt that the burlap, once again, was symbolic of the era. It was a material that was used by slaves and re-enslaved men to bring the crops to market. And it also brings an additional texture and depth to the paintings. The stalks of cotton are cut out of the same tin, once again, from the sharecropper's shack. The chains and shackles here are from the era, turn of the century. And again, it's an image of Lincoln looking through a window and reconsidering his legacy that we need to once again look at if his Emancipation Proclamation didn't hold true. We move into smaller pieces that reflect back to the slavery era. Each of these pieces incorporates an element of the news of the day. The news of the day was announcing that in this piece, the middle passage, that slave ships were arriving to Savannah and would be sold and would be met at a certain date and time. This piece, titled The Long March, has an image of Martin Luther King and Andrew Young, who has visited this exhibition in person, and I'm quite proud to say he has. And up out of the era of slavery come our civil rights marchers. Again, another piece, Hallelujah. Again, the articles of the era depicted in a way that not only bring the viewer closer to this history, but allows the images to feel as if they're coming up out of them. The paintings that we have on this wall have the same aspect of incorporating multimedia, journalism of the era. I'm a former reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and editor for Atlanta Magazine, so I've incorporated my journalism background into these pieces in a way that sort of brings my career in full circle. This painting here is Bay Lane. Again, Bay Lane here in Savannah, where thousands of men were sold into slavery. Behind the windows of this painting, you'll see the actual announcements of slaves being sold at Bay Lane. Just above is the Hamilton House, where Joseph Bryan, who was the chief slave seller of that era, lived. And next to it is the Montmollin Building, which sits right in City Market today. And it is a building where tens of thousands of men were sold into slavery. We move on to this next piece here. This is titled Worker One. It is made to represent every worker, the hundreds of thousands of men who were sold back into slavery after the end of the Civil War. His torso is made of the front of a coal-burning stove, and I thought that was symbolic because these were the men that mined coal and built the harnesses of steel within Birmingham, Alabama, that would industrialize the South. They did it as re-enslaved men without pay. And the other articles in there are of the era and are symbolic of the struggle that these men went through. Again, pieces that are representative of the era. This is Punishment. This is an image actually from a photograph of a man who was strapped to a pickaxe, and that was a form of punishment that these men endured. We move on to these two landscape pieces, the Road Workers and the Rock Breaker. These pieces look closely as if they are mostly portraits and landscape paintings. However, they are created directly from what photography we have from that era. These five men here are recreated from an actual photograph, and this rock breaker is a silhouette of an actual man who I captured from a photograph. We move back into the alcove to two of the historical pieces that have been included in exhibitions in Washington, D.C. at the Martin Luther King Library on Capitol Hill. This piece is titled Coal Miners. In it are many of the documents that were used by Douglas Blackmon to prove the thesis that slavery continued past the end of the Civil War, and two of the portraits of the men that endured that. And this piece speaks for itself, abolishing slavery. One of the recreated documents from the era that supposedly abolished slavery with implements of torture and of of imprisonment that were of that era attached to the piece. As we move back out of the alcove to a couple of the final pieces, I wanted to mention this piece in particular. It's a triptych. It's titled The Chattahoochee Brick Company. It is a depiction of the men who toiled within the Chattahoochee Brick Company in Atlanta, Georgia. One of the greatest ironies of this story is that shortly after Sherman burnt Atlanta to the ground, it was built back up with red brick. And those red bricks were all built from the Chattahoochee Brick Company, and the men who worked in there were re-enslaved men. We move on to this, what I call my book in motion, and it is an LCD screen embedded in gesso board with the photography that was left from that era, and Arch's watercolor paper on top with excerpts from the book, and the paper is treated to look as if it's been unearthed and held underground for many years, as this story was. Two more pieces to my right here. It is Worker 2, again the tin and the oil and acrylic on wood panel, and Fields of Fire. Two workers in cotton in a field that is in movement, in constant motion, as if they are soon to fall off the end of the earth, which is very much the way these men and children live their lives. I built this pulpit, which I call my folk art pulpit, in order that this book called Re-enslavement Revisited could sit upon it. I thought of no better way to display this art book than on a pulpit. As you can see, it's constructed of leather and chain. Throughout it is burlap and the pieces from the tin and other era documents and artifacts. Within each of the pages, I incorporate the photography from that era of re-enslaved men working. The glass is from turn of the century, found along the Savannah River. The brown that you see throughout is actually the soil from the Savannah River. Here we have an old tar paper piece for the tar paper shack with 34 pieces of glass to represent the number of states that were in the Union when the Civil War was fought. This is the man being punished, and as you go through, you'll see many of the original documents and photography that I used to build the exhibition from. These men were in a very difficult situation and pretty much forgotten until Douglas Blackmon's book came along and gave us something new to not only think about but to create from. And it's been a source of inspiration for me for the last 3.5 to 4 years, and I'm very happy that we're getting a chance to look at this work of art. I wanted to let you know that the work has been received well, and I'm very excited that it will be moving on to Atlanta shortly, and look forward to as many people as possible having a chance to view the work and understand more about this significant part of our history.